The wind was brittle that morning, curling like cold wire around the eaves of the lonely cabin set against the pine-edged slope. Frost clung to the window panes like old lace. Eloise Thatcher stood barefoot on the porch, wrapped in her late mother's wool shawl, watching the trail vanish into gray. Her breath came out in small clouds, like secrets escaping her chest. Beau had ridden off 2 days ago to fetch firewood. That's what he said, at least. He had packed his saddle with jerky and coffee and left her with half a jar of beans and a warning glare. "Don't burn through the rest of the kindling," he muttered before snapping the reins and riding into the pines. "Learn to ration, Eloise. It's what women were built for." She had watched the last coil of his trail dust settle, something dark rising in her chest like a slow nausea. 2 days now, and the hearth had gone cold. The pot-bellied stove sat like a tomb in the corner, its belly empty, its mouth yawning. She'd burned the last chair leg yesterday. Today, she considered the latter. Her fingers were red and cracked, her lips split from the dry air. The land had always been harsh, but it was the silence between walls that carved deepest. Once she had been a schoolteacher in Alabama, where warm rain kissed the windows and children brought her wildflowers. Now, there were only pine needles, sharp wind, and a dog named Wicket who had stopped barking 2 nights ago. She checked the barn. No sign of him. No fresh prints, not even raccoon tracks. Wicket's body lay stiff near the haystack, curled like he'd just gone to sleep. She knelt beside him and laid a hand over his side, whispering, "You waited too, didn't you?" She buried him with a wooden spoon because the ground was too hard to take a shovel. Her palms blistered, the cold biting through her skirts as she worked. No one would come. Not for her. Not out here. The marriage had been fast, too fast. Beau had been sweet-tongued when he came through town last summer, his shirt clean, his promises cleaner. He'd spoken of land, of building something true. "You'll be mistress of your own place," he'd said. "None of those small-town stairs. Just sky and room to breathe." He hadn't said the nearest neighbor was 6 miles south and drunk most days. He hadn't said the ground barely grew potatoes, that the roof leaked, that his temper flared hotter than summer asphalt. When the kindness had faded, it hadn't been sudden, it had frayed, like a rope rubbed raw. Less talk, less laughter. Then the slaps. Then the silence. She tried to believe he'd return. That he'd bring firewood, maybe bread, maybe even smile again like he had the day he lifted her into the wagon and said, "We'll start fresh." But deep down, something had settled in her bones. A knowledge. Beau wasn't coming back. By late afternoon, the wind howled low across the hills. The sky darkened, not from storm, but from absence. She sat on the porch with Wicket's empty collar in her lap, rocking in the last chair that hadn't been torn apart for heat. The cold pressed through her dress like wet cloth. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her shawl tighter, teeth chattering. A shadow passed overhead, a hawk circling low. The land was thinning, and she was thinning with it. By evening, the sky turned a deep violet. Her body hurt in quiet ways, the ache behind her eyes, the throb in her temples, the slow fatigue in her knees. Hunger was now an old companion, not sharp but dull, like a faded bruise. She remembered a hymn her mother used to hum when days felt too long. She tried it on her tongue but the sound came out cracked. She imagined her old classroom, the row of girls in ribbon braids, the smell of chalk and lemon oil. How far away it all seemed. Like another life. Like another woman. Inside, the oil lamp sputtered out. No more wick. No more oil. Only the dark. She tried to sleep but couldn't. Her body was too cold, her heart too loud. She curled beside the stove, tucking her skirts around her legs, whispering words not meant for any ears. "I won't die for you, Beau." But the lie tasted bitter. At some point during the night, she must have fallen into half-sleep. The kind where the body shuts down but the soul still paces. She dreamed of warm kitchens, of hands in her hair, of being chosen and kept. Then the dream changed. A knock. Not at the door, but inside her. A presence. She woke to a sound. Not wind. Not coyote. Something closer. Footsteps. slow, deliberate. From the woods. She tried to rise, but her legs trembled. She crawled toward the window, heart punching in her ribs. Through the glass, nothing moved. But the feeling stayed. She whispered, "Bo?" Silence answered. Then, somewhere behind the cabin, a single creak of snow under weight. A branch snapped. A shape passed the barn. Too tall for a wolf. Too slow for a deer. She crawled back to the hearth, clutching the cold poker. If Bo had come back, he'd come angry. If it was a stranger, she'd bargain. If it was death, she hoped it was quick. But nothing came. The silence returned. The air thickened like the sky before snow. She didn't know how long she sat like that, back pressed against the wall, eyes wide, breathing shallow. And then she saw it, a glow outside, far off. Not fire. A lantern? She crawled toward the door, barely able to stand, hands shaking as she lifted the latch. The cold roared in. The world beyond the porch was full of stars. She stepped out, barefoot on snow, breath hitching. And then, across the tree line, she saw him. A silhouette, tall and still, wrapped in deerskin, face half lit by the moon. He did not move. Did not wave. But something in her chest unfroze at the sight of him. She didn't know yet what his name was. Or what he would do. Or what kind of man he might be. But she knew one thing with the weight of iron in her belly. He wasn't Bo. And Bo wasn't ever coming back. The storm had passed, but its teeth remained buried in the land. Snow crusted over the prairie like dried salt, brittle underfoot. Trees stood like soldiers turned to stone, their branches heavy with silence. Talon rode without urgency, his horse a soft shadow against the pale hills. He wasn't hunting game. Not anymore. The morning had carried the scent of something wrong, too much quiet, not enough motion. The animals had scattered westward in the night, away from something they couldn't name. Talon trusted that instinct more than his own thoughts. The land whispered, and he listened. His moccasins touched the ground as he dismounted to inspect a broken fence line near the canyon's edge. There, near the post, he saw it, a smear of blood in the snow, small but old. Close by, paw prints, dog, by the look, and then, nothing. The trail ended suddenly, as if the animal had simply laid down and decided not to rise again. Talon's breath hung in the air, unmoving. He crouched, hand brushing the snow. Something else was here, faint marks of boots, uneven. Dragging. A woman's size, likely. Not recent. He rose slowly, eyes following the faint impressions that led back toward a wooded rise near the creek. He said no words. Words didn't suit the cold. It was half a mile before he found her. She lay half-curled beside a slumped barn, the roof sagging like a broken wing. Her skirts were frozen at the hem, her hands raw and purpled at the knuckles. She looked like something forgotten by both man and mercy. Her eyes were barely open, breath shallow, a faint cloud with each exhale. No fire. No sound. Talon approached quietly, as one does when nearing a wounded creature. His own steps made no sound. He knelt by her and saw the ring on her finger. Gold, dulled by time and cold. Her lips moved, barely, but no sound came. He pressed the back of his fingers to her cheek, burning cold. She flinched. A breath escaped her, hoarse and dry. "Don't bury me in his name." Talon blinked once. Not a plea. Not a prayer. A refusal. He moved quickly, decisively. Shed his coat, thick with buffalo lining, and wrapped it around her. Lifted her as gently as he could. She weighed little. A woman should not weigh this little, not if she was meant to live. His horse stood steady nearby, trained for silence and patience. He laid her across the saddle, securing her with his arms, her head resting against his shoulder. Her breath ghosted against his collarbone. He did not ride toward his camp, nor toward any known place. Instead, he took her south along the ridge, toward a hollow between twin stones where the wind didn't bite so hard and the creek still trickled warm under snow. There, he built fire. Dry wood from his pouch, flame coaxed from flint and memory. A small lean-to from pine boughs and his second blanket. He fed her broth warmed in a tin from his saddlebag, dipping it carefully to her lips. She took in just enough to not die. He didn't speak. Names did not matter yet. She stirred by the firelight. Murmured things he didn't catch, maybe children's names, maybe regrets. Her boots steamed by the flame, her face still pale but no longer blue. He kept watch all night, not sleeping, not blinking. Only waiting. In the dark, his mind wandered to old ghosts, his mother's voice, soft and severe, saying some women don't cry. That's how you know they're dying. He had seen it once before, long ago. A white woman left to rot by the trade road, her baby already gone in her arms. He'd buried her with nothing but cedar bark and her name scratched into stone. This one hadn't died yet. Not because someone helped. Because she refused. By morning, she could sit up. Not strong, but awake. She looked at him like he was part of the dream, part fear, part miracle. Her voice cracked when she asked, "Are you from the town?" He shook his head. "No town wants me." Her brow furrowed. She studied him as if trying to make out where he fit in the story. Not a savior. Not a neighbor. Something else. "Why'd you stop?" she asked. He looked toward the woods. The ground was speaking. She didn't understand, not fully. But she didn't question further. They stayed there for 2 days. The fire burned slow and warm. He gathered kindling while she slept. Caught a squirrel and roasted it over pine coals. She ate what she could, hands still trembling. On the second night, she sat beside him in silence, sharing his blanket. Not touching, but near enough that he could hear her heartbeat. The stars were out. She stared at them like they were strangers. "I used to think coming west was like being reborn," she whispered. "A place where no one knew what you were before." Talon said nothing. "I think he knew that too," she added. "He brought me out here because no one would come looking." Still he said nothing. His silence wasn't cold. It was accepting. She turned to him. "You didn't ask what happened." "I saw enough," he said simply. "You don't know my name." He turned his face toward the firelight. "Names are for those who stay." She didn't respond. But something loosened in her face. A knot undone. That night, she dreamed of warmth, and this time, the warmth stayed. On the third morning, she stood on her own. Shaky, but upright. She looked toward the ridge, toward where her cabin had been. "I can't stay in that place," she said. He nodded. "But I want to see it one last time." He offered her his hand. She took it. They rode slowly through the thawing woods. Snow still clung to the world, but beneath it, the earth was breathing again. Her face lifted to the sky, cheeks flushed not from cold but from something deeper awakening. As they approached the cabin, her heart stuttered. It looked smaller now. Just 4 crooked walls and a roof that sagged with shame. She dismounted and walked up the steps. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was still. Her chair was gone, burned. The stove cold. But her shawl still hung on the peg. She took it down. Folded it slowly. Talon waited outside. She stepped out, her face unreadable. In her eyes was not grief. Not yet forgiveness. But something older. A quiet reclaiming. "I think I'll take it back," she said. He looked at her. "The cabin?" "No," she said. "My name." And for the first time, she told it to him. "Eloise." He nodded. She waited. "And yours?" He hesitated, then answered, "Talon." She repeated it softly, like testing a song. They stood there for a long time, the wind curling around them. No one had spoken of salvation. But something like it had begun. The chimney no longer smoked, but the cabin had warmth again, not from fire, but from motion. Talon had repaired the eastern shutter with pine planks he'd carried in from the ridge. Eloise held the nails with gloved fingers that still shook from cold, though less than before. She didn't ask what made him stay. He didn't ask why she hadn't fled. The days came slow, like footsteps through tall grass. Talon slept in the barn, or near it. He built himself a cot from split timber and placed it beside the wagon. The horses knew him. Even the ravens that used to circle above began to watch from farther trees, like witnesses unsure whose side they were on. Eloise moved quietly through each day, no longer drifting like smoke. She washed the linens. She fixed the latch on the door. She found her own rhythm in the sound of chores, the scrape of the broom, the slosh of water thawed near the fire, the creak of the porchboards as she stepped out at dusk to breathe. At night, she read old pages from a weathered poetry book, the ink faded from years of grief. Talon didn't ask to hear them, but he listened from outside. She could feel it. Like something planted nearby and waiting for spring. Once, she caught him standing just beyond the window, sharpening his blade by lamplight. His eyes weren't staring into the dark, they were watching her reflection in the glass. When she met his gaze, he didn't flinch. He just nodded, as if to say you are still here, and that is enough. They spoke little, but their silences began to soften. On the third evening, Talon set a rabbit carcass on the chopping block and said, "You know how to cook this?" Eloise blinked. "I can learn again." He didn't smile. But something in his shoulders relaxed. She boiled the meat with dried herbs from her back shelf, flavors she had nearly forgotten, sage, salt, the whisper of pepper that caught in the nose. When she handed him a bowl, he accepted it with a quiet thank you, his voice low, like stone warmed by sun. They ate without hurry. Wind rattled the window panes, but inside, the table was steady. After dinner, she leaned against the post outside while Talon mended rope by the barn. She watched him in the golden lamplight. The way his hands moved. The precision of his silence. There was a gravity to him. He didn't fill space, but changed it. "You always alone?" she asked suddenly. He looked up. "Since my brother died." "Yes." She didn't ask how. Some things didn't require explanations to be honored. "My husband never liked silence," she said. Said it made a woman start thinking. He kept working the rope. Maybe that's why he feared it. She stared into the dark a long time. He said I talked too much. Talon's eyes met hers. "Then talk now." She didn't. But the offer curled around her like steam from a cup she hadn't held in years. The town noticed smoke had returned to the chimney after 3 weeks. Martha Copley, who ran the dry goods store, was the first to mention it. She said it to the preacher's wife in a whisper that slipped between lace gloves and button collars. "It's a Comanche, they say. Living up there with her. Or maybe not living. Maybe just sharing." Within days, stories took shape, fast ones, cruel ones. A widow turned wild. A squaw lover who betrayed her marriage bed. One man swore he'd seen her hauling firewood in a man's coat. Another claimed she was carrying the savage's child already. None of it was true. But truth had never mattered much in town. Eloise walked into town alone the next week. She needed flour and thread. She wore her bonnet and gray wool dress, head high, spine straight. Every eye watched her. The air in the store chilled as she entered. Martha Copley's lips curled into a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Well," Martha said, tallying with feigned sweetness. "We weren't sure if you were still among the living, dear." "I am," Eloise said, unbothered. "And I'm baking bread again." Another woman muttered behind the bolts of fabric, "Not the only thing she's warming." Eloise didn't turn. She paid in silence and walked out with her sack over her shoulder. The church bell rang as she passed it. She paused, looked up. A flock of doves sat on the steeple. She smiled at them, at least they stayed above the noise. Back at the cabin, she handed Talon the thread and said, "They'll talk more now." He looped the twine through a cracked leather strap. "They talked before. Just softer." That night, she brushed out her hair for the first time since the frost came. Her fingers worked through the knots slowly, and as the strands fell smooth against her back, she felt something unfurl in her chest. Like a knot loosening in an old rope. Talon came to the porch while she swept the dust from the steps. He carried a carved length of pine, a chair leg he had shaped anew. For the chair, she asked. He nodded. Figure we build one thing each day. They didn't touch. But when she took the wood from his hands, their fingers brushed and neither pulled back. The next morning brought frost again, sharper than before. Chickens clucked nervously from the coop. A hawk circled overhead. Eloise walked the fence line with a basket under one arm, her boots crunching frost-bitten earth. Talon followed behind, mending a loose rail with nails and steady rhythm. Halfway through the walk, she turned to him and said, I'm not afraid anymore. He raised an eyebrow. Of what? Of what I was before, she answered. He looked out toward the hill where the first fire had burned. Then you're not the same woman anymore. She breathed deep and let it out slowly. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from beyond the tree line. A man on horseback. Drunk. Gaunt. With a wound in his pride so deep it festered behind the eyes. Beau Thatcher had returned. The sun rose red and low across the plain that morning, bleeding through the frost like a bad omen. Eloise stood at the fence mending a tear in her shawl, fingers stiff but practiced. Talon moved with quiet precision beside her, placing a new rail where the old one had rotted through. Birds sang in hesitant bursts, as if uncertain the cold had truly passed. She felt the shift before she saw it, something in the stillness broke. A presence approaching, heavy and wrong. The sound of hooves cracked against the earth like bones snapping in winter. One rider. No cart. No companion. Talon looked up first. His eyes narrowed but his hands didn't leave the rail. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. Eloise turned slowly. The figure came over the ridge, hat low, coat dusty and creased with weeks of wear. The horse was thinner than she remembered. The man, too. Beau Thatcher. He rode with the slump of someone who'd lost more than a home, but his mouth still twisted with that cruel smile she knew too well, the kind that didn't match the eyes. Well, look who didn't die, he called, voice thick with liquor and spite. Eloise said nothing. She stood straight, her hands still holding the torn fabric. The wind caught her hair and pulled it gently across her shoulder like a veil of smoke. Beau reined in near the barn, dismounting with a groan and a stagger. His eyes flicked from Eloise to Talon, who stood unmoving, hammer still in his hand. This what you traded me for? Beau sneered, gesturing with his chin. A redskin with a dull knife? Talon didn't blink. Didn't move. His stillness was its own warning. Beau stepped closer. You really thought I was gone? Thought you could play settler with a savage and not face me again? Eloise breathed in deep, felt the old trembling rise in her bones, but it passed like a cloud across sunlight. She looked him in the eyes. You left me to die, she said, calm as a well. Beau chuckled bitterly. I gave you a chance. You didn't take it. That's on you. Talon stepped forward, slow and deliberate. His shadow fell long across the ground between them. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, You should leave. Beau turned to him, swaggering now. You got no say in this. She's my wife. No, Eloise said, louder this time. Not anymore. Beau's eyes snapped back to her, fury bubbling. You're still wearing my ring. She held up her hand. The ring was gone. Beau froze. Something in him cracked open then, pride, delusion, whatever mask he'd worn over the rot beneath. He stepped forward, hand twitching toward the knife at his belt. Talon didn't draw. He didn't flinch. He stood between Eloise and Beau like a stone planted in the prairie. You really want to do this? Beau hissed. In front of her? You already did, Talon answered. Beau lunged. It was fast, clumsy. Rage, not strategy. but Talon's movement was quieter than wind. He stepped aside, letting Beau's momentum carry him forward, off balance. Then a single movement, Talon's arm locked around Beau's wrist, twisting the blade free. With one sweep of the foot, Beau hit the ground hard, his breath knocked from him like a kicked drum. The knife landed in the dirt a few paces away. Talon didn't strike. He stepped back. Beau rolled, gasping, face red with humiliation more than pain. "You gonna kill me now?" he spat. "No," Talon said. "I don't bury cowards." Beau scrambled to his feet. His hands shook. His eyes darted from the knife to Eloise, then to Talon. There was no fight left, only venom. "You're nothing," he said to her. "You'll always be nothing." She stepped forward. "I was nothing to you," she said softly. "But not to myself. Not anymore." He laughed, short and sharp. "You think this life is gonna last? They'll turn on you too. All of 'em. You think the town will let you be?" She stared at him, her voice steady. "Let them come. I'd rather be judged for surviving than pitted for staying." Beau looked at her a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time. Not as the woman he'd left, not as the frightened wife by the fire, but as something harder. Something whole. He picked up his hat from the dirt. His eyes flicked one last time to Talon, who remained still, breath steady, eyes clear. Then Beau turned, got back on his horse, and rode away. He never looked back. Eloise didn't move until the dust had fully settled. Then she sat on the porch steps, her hands in her lap. Her shawl fluttered around her like wings that had been folded too long. Talon walked over and sat beside her. No words passed. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and indifferent. But she no longer feared it. Later that evening, while the sky bruised into lavender and gold, she took down the old sign Beau had nailed above the cabin door, Thatcher Homestead. She pulled it loose with a pry bar and dropped it into the fire without a word. Talon watched her with the quiet of a man who understands that some battles are sacred. And when the flames reached the name, curling it into ash, Eloise whispered something to the wind. It carried it off gently, as if it, too, was ready to forget. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. The cabin breathed again. Its walls no longer echoed loneliness, but softened with routine, shared footsteps on the porch, split firewood stacked in careful rows, the smell of venison roasting low and slow in the hearth. The air, once brittle with dread, now hummed with something warmer, older, like belonging. Eloise moved differently now. She walked with her eyes forward, not downward. Her hands no longer trembled when she buttoned her dress, or when she reached for the kettle. And each morning, she stepped out barefoot just to feel the earth under her soles, to remind herself she'd survived a winter meant to kill her. Talon remained steady, saying little, always near. He fixed the cabin's back wall, then built a bench beneath the west-facing window. When he spoke, it was usually with his hands, the way he left an extra bowl of soup on the table, or a woven braid of sweetgrass on the sill to ease her sleep. Eloise had stopped questioning those gestures. She received them the way one receives sunlight, without needing to understand it. They never spoke of love. There was no need. Then came the messenger. A boy on a painted horse, hat askew, dust all over his coat. He brought a note from the town sheriff, plain parchment, sharp ink. Beau Thatcher found dead 6 miles north. Knife in his boot. Empty bottle in his hand. Looks like his horse dragged him some ways after he fell. Thought you should know. Town burial tomorrow. He named you in his final words. You ain't obligated to come. Sheriff Amos. Eloise read it twice, then set it on the table beside the tin of dry tea. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't catch. Talon said nothing. She looked out the window at the dusk unfolding. Do you think the dead can hear apologies? He answered after a pause. Only if they're spoken to the living. She stood then. Took her shawl. Tied her hair back. Her breath was steady as she laced her boots. I want to go, she said. Not for him. but for the woman I was when he left me. The ride into town was long and wind-bitten, but not painful. Talon rode beside her, silent as always, but watchful. The townspeople parted like river reeds when they arrived. Eloise walked straight through their stares. Martha Copley was near the chapel door, mouth already half-curled when she saw them. But Eloise didn't slow. She didn't stop to answer whispers or tilt her head in shame. She simply walked to the steps, stood still, and looked at the coffin. Beau's name had been carved into the wood by a drunk carpenter, crooked, rushed, careless. She stared at it for a long while. "I forgive the woman who stayed too long," she said aloud. Then turned and walked away. No one followed her. No one dared. The wind picked up on the way back, soft at first, then bolder. It tugged at her braid, pulled at the shawl like a child begging attention. Talon stopped his horse and tilted his face toward the sky. "Storm's coming." "Let it," Eloise murmured. But when they reached the ridge above the cabin, they saw it. Smoke. Thin. Black. Unnatural. Talon dismounted in one fluid motion, already unstrapping his bow. Eloise's heart punched against her ribs as they sprinted down the slope, hooves pounding behind them. The cabin came into view, a window shattered, the front door ajar. Inside, the table had been overturned. The hearth knocked cold. On the wall, a message had been carved into the wood above the fireplace. Squaw lover. A warning. Or a promise. They weren't welcome. Talon stood in the center of the room, eyes narrowed, jaw tense. Eloise touched the wall, tracing the crude letters with her fingertips. "I knew it wouldn't last," she whispered. He turned to her, voice low. "Then why does it still stand?" She looked around. The walls hadn't burned. The roof was whole. The floor held firm beneath her feet. Because he had built it well. Because she had helped. She stepped outside into the wind, staring at the hills. Her past had tried to bury her here. The town had tried to shame her quiet. But neither had managed to kill what had taken root between these boards, dignity, and something close to grace. "I want to stay," she said. Talon stood behind her, arms crossed. "They'll come again. Then let them find me standing." He said nothing. But a moment later, he stepped beside her and laid something in her palm. A small carving, cedar wood, shaped into a hawk's wing. "For your door," he said. She held it to her chest, eyes stinging but dry. That night, they rebuilt what had been disturbed. Together. No fear, no doubt, only motion. Talon repaired the window while Eloise swept the floor. She boiled new broth. Lit the lantern. Set the table upright. They sat together under the hush of storm clouds, two souls that had outlived winter. Rain fell near midnight. Slow at first, then heavy, washing the roof clean. Eloise stepped outside barefoot and let it soak her skin. She lifted her face to the sky and laughed, not loudly, but fully. The sound was something the wind hadn't heard from her in years. Talon stood in the doorway, watching her, rain dripping from his brow. "Come in," he said gently. She didn't move. "Say it." He blinked. "What?" "My name." He hesitated only a moment, then spoke with care, as if shaping something sacred. "Eloise." She smiled. Closed her eyes. And the wind, as if in agreement, whispered it once more through the trees. Eloise. Not wife. Not widow. Not what was taken from her, or what she had lost. But what remained. What endured. What chose to stay.